We're recording. We are back for another episode of Advanced Performance Radio. We have Leah from the Plant Strong Dietitian here to talk to us today. I'll give Leah the floor to introduce herself and tell us who she is and what she does.
Sweet. So I am a sports dietitian. So I've been a sports dietitian for 5 or 6 years now, but I predominantly practice in the plant-based space. So I work with a lot of vegans, vegetarians, people interested in just plant-based eating in general, and a whole host of other things. But that's kind of my main niche, at least for now.
Nice. So with your dietetic studies, did you go into that straight from school, or was that afterwards, or what sort of led you to go down that path?
Yeah, so I went straight from high school into uni. So I started uni when I was 16, graduated that when I was 20, and then kind of took a couple of years off for some personal reasons. And then I kind of started my career around 22. But yeah, straight from high school to uni to study dietetics. I knew exactly what I wanted to do at that point. No, I wanted to work in sports nutrition. Grew up with my mom being a bodybuilder. I was like super into lifting. Hadn't gotten into powerlifting yet. Super into it now. But yeah, that's what led me down the path. And I was like, either it was ex-phys or dietetics, and I chose dietetics.
Yeah, and I think it's the dietetics field. Obviously, it's a lot of people, because I nearly went down that route in clinical dietetics and decided that working in hospitals was not my jam. So yeah, it's do you think, in terms of obviously the dietetic field, that there's so much clinical space work that it can almost be off-putting for people that sort of want to like ride it out to make it to sports dietitian?
Yeah, I think you do have to go through just a lot of training from a medical side of things that you may not end up using. So I can see why people maybe take a different route to like working in this space. But for myself, I do a lot of medical stuff. So I do a lot of like complex gastrointestinal issues and stuff alongside the sports nutrition. So for me, it felt really worth it. But yeah, absolutely, I can see why people would be deterred from such a long degree.
Yeah, I remember like the first day of uni, and I was asking my lecturer, I'm like, okay, so when do we get to do anything on like sort of sports or health? And she's like, I'm like, okay.
Yeah, there was one subject for one semester on sports nutrition. Everything else is more like once I graduated, I started to upskill in that space a lot more. But the actual dietetics course, very minimal sports nutrition stuff in there.
I mean, I used to work alongside a lady who did dietetics, clinical dietetics at university, and we were both commenting on the fact that like going from like the clinical dietetics to sports dietetics like isn't the big jump that you think it would be in terms of like extra study. So
Yes.
it's, I mean, I think obviously Australian universities are very different to a lot of other places in the world. Like I've got a few I guess friends in the industry that have just done sports performance nutrition as a master's degree.
Sure.
So it's, I think Australia's very in front with some things, and then also with other things probably a little bit behind. So, but how did you find yourself moving into the space like predominantly plant-based? Was that a personal choice of your own that then sort of led down that route, or?
Yeah, so halfway through my dietetics degree, I became plant-based myself. And that was purely just from an ethical point of view. I just didn't want to eat animals anymore. So it wasn't even from a health perspective, like whatsoever, or because I learned something super amazing in my degree that made me turn vegan or anything like that. It was more cared about animals, cared about the environment, went plant-based. And then once I graduated, I was like, just started putting out content in that space because I'm like, I'm a plant-based athlete and I was kind of sharing my journey, and it all kind of just snowballed from there really quickly. So I didn't, I guess, think I would end up in a niche where that's basically all I did, but now it is all I do 60 hours a week. So pretty cool to be here, but I never like, I guess, really intended to at the start.
Yeah. Do you ever have any clients come through that aren't plant-based?
Yeah, all the time. So I suppose like if makeup of my clients, they're probably 85% plant-based, somewhere along the spectrum, whether that's fully vegan, veggie, or just like interested in plant-based eating. And then the rest would be more because I work very much in like, I guess, very specific areas. So work with neurodivergence, so people with like autism, ADHD, those kinds of things. I work with trans athletes, queer people a lot. So some people will come to me who are not plant-based at all, but fall into like those other careers, or the complex gut issues things.
Yes. So it's like the queen of niches.
I literally, that I made my whole career on like a niche of a niche of a niche.
Yeah, it's like collecting niches like their Pokemon.
Yeah, so if someone's looking for that very specific thing, like I'm your gal.
Yeah, cool. So obviously on the, I've spoken to obviously a few other coaches who predominantly work in the plant-based space, and I've got a few friends that are coaches that work in that area specifically. Would you say, obviously we touched on this when we spoke the other day about how at the moment there's just this huge push on the carnivore space, saying obviously, I'm sure you've seen all the content from these coaches trying to, I guess, position people to think that consuming plants in general, not just plant-based, but just a fucking salad is not good for us. And it's, I think there's no such thing as a bad diet. I'm sure you would assume that there's obviously sliding scales of efficiency and health.
Totally.
But would you say that it's a bit harder at the moment to get people to take plant-based seriously because of this huge push that we have in the carnivore space at the moment, obviously working that opposite side of the coin?
Yeah. I think it's interesting because in terms of like my algorithm, I don't get any of that. Like I definitely hear about it from other coaches and other people in the space. And they're like sending me stuff. I'm like, I personally don't see that stuff like ever. So I think that's just because of the niche that I interact with so much, being plant-based. But I think it's an interesting phenomenon. I think a lot of people get into that particular space, I mean, from what I see, just from a digestive point of view. So usually it's a lot of people that have had chronic digestive issues, whether that's IBS, inflammatory bowel disease, whatever the case may be. And then they're hearing from these carnivore people that, oh, if you just eliminate all plants from your diet, then it'll get rid of your gut issues. And then they go down this route of eliminating all these plants. And typically we see a reduction in some of these gut issues because they're taking out so many food groups and so many potential things that were triggers for them. And their digestive issues do resolve. But I think there is such a misinterpretation of what that means, because typically people are like, oh, my gut issues resolved, this must mean I have like really good gut health, like a really good gut microbiome. But we know, looking at research, the more animal products and the less plant-based food you eat, the worse gut health you tend to have, even though you may not be experiencing symptoms because you're not eating these foods that are high in things like FODMAPs, like fermentable carbohydrates and things like that, and fiber. So I can see why people go down the rabbit hole and stay there. But I mean, looking at the research, we know it's obviously not great to not consume fruits and vegetables and things like that.
Yeah, we don't want to use the word research. We'll get told that we're getting paid off by some company to quote research.
I'm actually funded by Big Vegetable.
Big carrots put money in my pocket.
Exactly.
I think it's the same could be said from the opposite reaction. If you've got someone who's gone from, let's say, an omnivore-based diet, and they have gone towards a plant-based diet, I'd say there's almost a bell curve in between the two, where a lot of the sort of maybe negative effects they had from either diet sort of subside, and people associate the top of that bell curve with, oh, okay, well, this is better because my symptoms have subsided. And it could be, let's say we're going from an omnivore-based diet and we move over to a plant-based. It's like, yeah, but you removed a lot of processed foods. Oh, so 100%. You've seen an improvement in health and digestion and whatever other symptoms because you've removed these heavily processed foods. And then the opposite side, from the plant-based to, or omnivore to carnivore, if you've got gut health issues and you remove fiber and you remove high FODMAP foods, we see that reduction, but it doesn't necessarily equate to, oh, this is better or that's better.
It doesn't mean it's healthier. You just might be having less symptoms on a carnivore diet, which Yeah, that's like a whole rabbit hole in its own. But I think definitely just from a FODMAP, food chemical point of view, like whatever you're reacting to, like they are predominantly often going to be in your plant-based foods. So removing
Yeah.
them is going to equal less symptoms. But yeah, absolutely. On the like the flip side of that coin, some people go completely vegan or plant-based and then experience way less gut issues. It just depends on what the issue is to begin with, right? Because it could also exacerbate it.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people quantify their gut health issues around a certain single food group. Oh, okay, it's this causing it or it's that causing it. So, well, maybe it's a mixture of the fact that you eat highly processed foods, you don't consume enough fiber, you don't consume enough water. There's so many carryover things that people sort of ignore and they major in the minors and they're like, oh, it's because I've gone carnivore. Like, I love the, I'm eating the way our ancestors did. Are you going to diet 30 the way they did as well? Or are we going
Yeah, it's like, what's the goal?
Or, and I think I've had someone use the same argument for like I guess the plant-based base, and they use the gorilla argument.
Yeah.
Like, and it's like, okay, like I'm not saying it's not good or it's not an appropriate way, but don't use that argument. Like it's
a weird one. Like I think
yeah.
like the appeal to nature fallacies are weird. And obviously
Yes.
like the often check out. And then also just comparing yourself to a species that you are not is also a strange argument to make. Like it makes we have a lot of population research when it comes to nutrition, right? So it to look at that and the outcomes from that as opposed to making these like weird appeal to nature fallacy arguments.
So okay, well, crocodiles live to 100. You're not exactly going to swim around a swamp and bite people, so
exactly. That's a weird point.
The same. It's the same thing when people try and quote research studies, and they're like, "Okay, that was only done in rats." So, like, we don't have any quantifiable evidence for an extended period of time in humans. So, until such a point in time, the information that we're provided, we'll take it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like that's a starting place for research, not the be all and end all.
Yes, and I think I mean, so many people get so caught up in these little minute details that it's like, man, just eat better, just eat a more balanced diet, consume enough fiber, drink enough water, get enough vitamins and nutrients, and just leave it at that.
I think having a really black and white approach is just like very appealing and very sexy to like people. They're like, oh, I'm fully vegan or I'm fully carnivore, or like they're making these like huge shifts in their dietary intake when maybe they could have, just reduced intake of processed foods, increased intake of fruits and vegetables, and like all these little things that we know are beneficial to long-term health. That doesn't mean you need to completely change your diet like 180.
I think it's an identity thing. People latch onto these, okay, like I'm carnivore, or I mean, my entire identity is being vegan. It's like, okay, you're a person with a name that just happens to be vegan. That's not who you are in every aspect. And I think it's just, I mean, social media flows into, I mean, you look at the comment section on some of these carnivore posts and it's like an echo chamber of stupid.
Yeah.
And
but even the vegan ones too, to be fair, like,
yeah,
they're always just an echo chamber of themselves, right?
And it is. And like, I've also dealt with clients who have come from a vegan perspective, and I'm like, okay, you're eating like 40 grams of protein a day.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care how much like plants and vegetables you're eating and how healthy you think that is. There's still a massive void there of us hitting the necessary targets for overall optimal health, if you can call it that. But I think it comes down to trying to the information surrounding, like, if you've seen that, what's her name? That banana girl that lives out in the bush, that all fruitarian.
Freely the banana girl, or
yeah, that's the one. That's her. And it's like, yeah, I just eat 7 mangoes for breakfast. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, that's that whole food, plant-based, no oil, like very specific. Like, I don't know if you know too much about vegan diets, but there are niches within veganism, and
I
can
imagine
crazy as carnivore.
Well, I think I saw one the other day. It was like a raw food, fruit only diet. I'm like, that's not going to be very fun. So
yeah, there's a lot of that. So like whole food plant-based is one, but there's raw till 4, there's fruitarian, there's fully raw. Like there are a lot of niches that it's just this extra restriction that is just totally unnecessary.
it is, and it's taken like I would say that being vegan probably requires not it requires more diligence in what you're doing, because obviously
Yep.
to make sure that you are hitting all those necessary targets for health and hormone function, all that sort of stuff, it requires more input, more work. But then you've got some diet structures and styles that are so far away from what the general public can manage long term. You know what I mean? Like you see these ones like go back to the carnivore side of things. It's like only eating like the genitalia of some animal. It's like, fuck, man, why do you have to make things so hard? Like,
I think it's just a social media thing, right? Like I wonder if social media didn't exist, I feel like people wouldn't be taking it that far, but it is what gets the views, right? Like it's interesting and people find it interesting.
it does. And like I think with like the seed oil side of thing, that's obviously a massive one at the moment. And it's like, yeah, no worries, Marty the scaffolder. I'm going to listen to you about seed oils killing you when you literally snort cocaine every weekend. Like,
Yeah, you've got a vape in your hand right now. Yeah.
yeah, you get a vape, you're drinking every weekend, like taking fucking steroids made in someone's bathtub. Like, yes, I'll listen to you about health. So it's just, I think the more outlandish, the more, I guess, obscure, the more, unfortunately, stupid's contagious. And it creates these like you've got. I'm not sure if you've seen that guy Eddie Abu. He's like he's a bodybuilder from the UK, and he's going on about like he did a post saying that baby formula is bad for babies. Like, and I was like, wow, man, that's a really low blow.
That's a hot take.
And then he's trying to say that like it's the whole thing's like eggs and like I'm not even sure if they call it carnivore, like meat and fruit sort of setup, like, and trying to demonize seed oils and all these different things. And it's very much a case of in the comment section, like, hey man, can you please provide some research to back up the bold claim you're making? Oh, just wake the fuck up and do your own research. I'm like, that's not the way this is. That's not the way this works.
Yeah.
I remember when Pete Evans tried saying that bone broth was better for babies than breast milk, and I'm like, what?
What are you going on? Yeah, and it's also like very harmful messages, right, to people that are already in, I guess, a vulnerable space. So it's usually targeting people that already have an eating disorder or young people.
Oh, for sure.
Those are the ones that kind of latch onto this information.
I think the easiest thing to leverage off is fear, and the easiest thing to sell is hope.
Yeah.
And it's a sad reality of like you've got some people like from, let's say, the mental health side of things, because I do a fair bit of work with mental health myself, having like a Dr. Zeus book of mental health disorders. So it's people in that space are already susceptible to being, you know what I mean, having their views shifted, and I guess there being a lot of fear based around what they're doing. Or if you've got someone who's got really chronic gut issues for a long period of time, they're going to be almost clutching at straws trying to fix those issues. And a lot of these individuals, that's I'll leave it at that, knowingly leverage off this fear in trying to get this said person into their, you know what I mean, like their structured style of eating. And you've got people trying to tell the general public, oh, like when you go to a restaurant, just like go up to the chef and say, don't cook my food in seed oils. It's like, man, if you want a mouthful of spit in your food, like, yeah, go right ahead. But like,
can you imagine, like, I've seen someone taking their own oil to a restaurant and being like, can you use this? And I'm like, yeah, like a chef is not going to love that feedback.
Well, I'm pretty sure there's like regulations as to what they can and can't use. And because you are entering the building, there's no sort of process of health. I mean, if you had the health department come in and then saw you use oil that someone's brought in themselves, you'd probably lose your license. You lose your.
I'm sure there are like regulations around it. Yeah.
And I mean, I think any chef worth his salt's probably going to spit in your food. So, but it's it's very difficult to try and, I guess, come at people with like, okay, like there's a straightforward basic approach to obviously improving your overall health, rather than, oh, I've got this really fucking niche thing where like dust your food with fucking unicorn dust. Like it's so obscure, but unfortunately obscure sells, because the human public are very they love gimmicks.
100%. I think it's also sometimes the simplicity of it. Like, oh, all I have to do is remove all animal products from my diet, or remove all plant-based foods from my diet, other than this like list of things of decrease your intake of these foods and increase your intake of these foods and be mindful of this. And like, all the basic things when it comes to nutrition, like you and I and people in the industry, like we know what a good, healthy, balanced diet looks like, and that it can exist in many different ways and you can do it so many different ways.
Yeah.
I think having that approach of like, all you need to do is remove gluten, or all you need to do is this. It's like, it does simplify it for someone who's not educated in the space. So I can, again, see why people gravitate towards that.
Yeah, for sure. And I've had people come in like guns blazing who are like, oh, I need to do this and I need to do that, and all the rest of them. I'm like, okay, cool. So like, have you managed to get results on your own? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay, so like, how about we come up with a little bit of a different approach, because obviously what you're doing is not working. And I remember one individual was like, oh, I'm lactose intolerant. I'm like, what makes you say that? They're like, oh, whenever I have my dare iced coffee in the morning, I'm straight on the toilet within like 30 minutes. And I'm like,
you're like, coffee, but milk, and also sugar. Like, there's a lot of variables here.
Well, there's like some like ridiculous amount of fat in a dare iced coffee. I'm like, what? One of the small ones? Like, no, one of like the big ones, like the 700 ml ones. I'm like, and you wonder why you were shitting in 30 minutes, like.
Yeah.
but no, it's the dairy. It's not the common sense of taking a product that works as a laxative. So
yeah, it's like when people eat like a massive bowl of pasta and they're like, it's clearly the gluten that's made me feel sick. And I'm like, well, you've just eaten 3 bowls of pasta, so maybe it's that. So people are going to latch on to what feels the easiest to fix, I think.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I'm allergic to gluten. It's like, what makes you say that? Oh, whenever I have a Domino's pizza, I'm like, it's a fucking Domino's pizza. Like, but it's unfortunately, it's hard to sell to people that like, okay, there is a straightforward approach to this. I had a client recently who was told by one of our lovely friends, the naturopaths, that she needed to have like, it was like 9 different supplements, this huge diet of elimination, like this, that, the other. And I'm like, okay, how's that going for you? She's like, oh, not the best.
No.
Obviously, did an appropriate restructure of her nutritional intake and started reintroducing foods one at a time until we found sort of the tolerance. And she's like, oh, I can actually eat carbs. I'm like, yes, you can. But,
I think that happens all the time, right? Like, especially working in the gastrointestinal space so much, I'll have clients come to me that have gone to practitioners like that, and they've got a crazy list of supplements that they're taking every day, a really restricted diet, and still are symptomatic. And then we have to like work back from this like hole that they've dug themselves in, which is super common. Again, I can see why they're kind of grasping at straws, but I really wish these practitioners like wouldn't take advantage of people in that way to often sell them just a bunch of products.
Yeah, and I think it's very much a case like you see like the local buy and sell pages where like you have someone calling themselves a gut health mentor trying to sell like some challenge to someone. I'm like, okay, like I don't know any university that offers gut health mentor as a bachelor's or a master's. So, and I think it's funny how if you needed surgery on your knee, no one would go to like some dude around the corner and have it operated on. And if you needed, your car worked on, you wouldn't go to a place that wasn't a mechanic. But when it comes to people's health and their diet, they will literally trust anyone.
Yeah.
And it's naturopaths, and I don't know where it's come from, but chiropractors are really bad for it.
I can't say I deal with a ton of chiropractors, but are they giving nutrition advice?
Well, do you know who Paul Saladino is?
Oh, the name rings a bell. Couldn't
like some of these practitioners, let's call them, is you look at it and it seems to be a common trend. There's a lot of chiropractors giving out very detailed nutrition advice, and I'm like, and they're, oh, but they're a doctor. I'm like, of chiropractic. I mean,
It's completely different scope of practice.
Completely different field. And it's, I guess, because there's no real barrier, there's no regulation. Like if you start going around calling yourself a dietitian, and you're not, you're going to hear about it pretty quickly because there's relevant governing bodies and things like that. But if you can do a 2-day course and call yourself a nutritionist. So
yeah, it can, like you could do a 3-year bachelor's degree, or you could do like a 2-day course, and both of those would be the same title.
Yeah.
So I think it makes it tricky for the public to navigate in terms of who they should go to for nutrition advice.
Yeah, and it's this. We're still in it. Like we're at the year 2024, and we've still got people going, "Oh, but that person looks really good, so they must know what they're talking about."
Yeah,
and
there is.
I was like, okay, like we're at a point where we've got artificial intelligence. You can literally ask ChatGPT most things, and it'll come up with like a relevant answer for the question you have. But also, like PTs, like people are still unaware that personal trainers aren't in any way, shape, or form qualified or capable of giving detailed nutrition advice.
Yes, absolutely. And I do see that all the time with people getting information from personal trainers who have no business giving advice around nutrition, or at least the detail in which they're giving it, like actual nutrition plans and whatnot.
I think one of my pet peeves with PTs is where it says like on their blog of what they do, and it's like nutrition advice. It's about, man, you know damn well you're writing fucking diets. Don't lie.
Yeah, 100%. And
Like,
it's almost treated like an add-on to nutrition. Like they're like, oh, I'll just add that onto my service. And I'm like, nutrition is actually quite complex and requires a fair bit of education to understand well and to navigate well, and then work with clients on an individual basis. So it's not just something that you tack on to your service as a PT.
yeah, and like obviously, I don't work in the clinical space. Like sports and performance is my sort of jam, and even doing like my post grad, going through that and learning more and more and more, and like obviously having some like really good tutors, I'm like, well, I know fucking nothing. Like it was,
Yeah.
you learned something. Like obviously going into like just some, I guess like calculated sweat rates and working with like sweat, like obviously offsets and stuff like that. And it's fuck, man, like this is just even dealing with like behavior change method in clients, and understanding proper behavior change and understanding. And this is probably one of the ones that where I think PTs run the risk of causing some real damage, is understanding when a client's developing an eating disorder, whether it's anorexia, bulimia, orthorexia, or they're developing like really, really religious biases around nutrition, or they've developed REDS, or any of these sort of, I guess, fairly serious conditions that we can come across, and not understanding, like when a client's develops REDS and PTs is like, oh, I'm just going to drop the calories again.
Yes.
Fuck,
And same with
man, like,
space, right? Like there's a lot of people that will do a bodybuilding show and become a bodybuilding coach, and then they're really messing up these people and giving them eating disorders and HA and whatnot. So yeah, it can be dangerous to give out nutrition advice if you don't know what you're doing. And I'm always wary of someone who's too overconfident in themselves, because I think the more that you know in this space, the more you are aware of how much there is to learn. So then you come at it from a point of being quite humble, I suppose. But if someone is like, I'm confident, I know the answers to everything, and I'm like, well, all right, that's a red flag.
I think in regards to that, like you hear I've seen PTs and in their bio it says like gut health expert. And it's like, I remember listening to a podcast with Dr. Gabriella Fundaro, who did her PhD thesis in gut microbiome, and she calls herself a gut health specialist because she's like, no one's an expert because we don't know enough about it yet.
We don't know enough. That's it. Like we're like tip of the iceberg when it comes to gut health and gut microbiome and understanding any of that.
And it's so we got someone with a PhD in that topic calling himself a specialist, but old Susie Fit with her Cert 3 and 4 is an expert.
An expert, yeah.
So, and I think I'm quite, I guess, happily surprised when I have someone ask me what my qualifications are. Like a client, when they come in and they're like, oh, look, I want to work with you for nutrition. Like, where did you study? Like, what are your qualifications? Do you hold insurance? And I'm like, oh, actually, yes, I do. And it's refreshing, because most people
just don't ask.
Yeah, and I think I've had a few clients in the past where they quite obviously will listen to anything that you say. So I try and stretch the boundaries of how ridiculous the thing I'm asking them to do is, to see if they just
If
stop me
they'll
and go,
do
hang on, that doesn't sound right.
it.
And some, because I guess I try and explain to people to be more critical with their thinking, the information they're absorbing. Just because you have, I did a seminar on hypertrophy last year, and I sort of led with it saying, hey, look, I'm just running this seminar with my experience, what my education's taught me, and like obviously coaching quite a few clients, but don't take what I say as gospel. Like if you want to question me at any time, please do so. Or if you want to go away and do a bit of your own research, by all means, go right ahead. But because I learned that the hard way, you start doing seminars and you start doing like add-on courses to your qualifications. And I guess the first, because I had experience with like the Poliquin side of things.
Yes, yep.
And did courses with people who had done all the Poliquin stuff, and I'm like, oh man, these people sound really smart. And you like go away and do a bit of research, you're like, wow, that person's actually an idiot. So,
like some people just come across so confident that you're almost like willing to believe them, and then you go away and you're a bit skeptical and you're like, oh, actually that confidence was probably not coming from the right place.
Yeah, and I think like one of the areas that I fell short was like earlier on in my career, I got told about like the whole IgG testing and stuff like that, and I guess fell prey to like listening when I should have been more critical. And I was like, wow, fuck, this actually doesn't work. The research doesn't back up what we're doing. And I went and paid for one myself. It would have been like, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. And I was like, wow, I just wasted my money.
But yeah, and they're pretty expensive. They're not cheap.
Like $400-500, something like that. But I think it's the only way you truly learn is when you recognize your mistakes and go, okay, cool. Like and you learn from it, because every time I guess anyone fucks up, it's just a learning opportunity, really. So it's not sort of the end of the world. It's just a chance to go, okay, cool. I probably should have done things differently next time. And I'm not sure about you, but I've had that with clients all the way up until now. I've been coaching for 16 years and still have that happen occasionally where I'm like, oh, well, should have done things differently.
But yeah, it's like a constant learning experience, right? And like, especially from a research point of view, nutrition is quite young. Like it's in itself is in its infancy compared to other areas of research. So we're always learning new things, and we constantly have to adapt to the new things we are learning.
And I guess a good example of that is I'm not sure if you saw that research come out recently, like what the sort of upper threshold for protein absorption, obviously metabolism, was that came out. I think it was like maybe early this year, and it sort of highlighted that like as long as kidney and liver function is okay, there's sort of like we can push the limits a lot more than what we thought we could. Yeah, and I've got some clients who are on 3 grams per kilo body weight because they train 4 hours a day. So
sometimes it makes sense, particularly if you're like very lean and very muscular and you're wanting to retain as much muscle mass as possible, and you're trying to get leaner. Like bodybuilding comes to mind, right? Like where they often try and push that protein intake to that kind of very upper threshold of what we would see. And I think that makes sense.
Yeah. Obviously on that topic, like, and obviously you work with powerlifters and strength athletes and body composition clients. When we start getting towards like those, I guess, say upper limit sort of calorie areas, like the 3,500, 4,000, 4,500, do you find it difficult, obviously, to hit the necessary targets without sort of having that cascade of effects? For instance, like if we're using plant-based protein sources, obviously the fat content comes up quite substantially as a byproduct. Do you find that difficult, or how do you approach that with clients to try and allow them to hit the necessary numbers, but without that sort of like really large influx in sodium and like fats that come from like the plant-based stuff?
It's a completely different ball game working with plant-based clients as opposed to people that are omni. It's like it's a lot easier to navigate because as an omnivorous person, you've got your carb foods, your protein foods, and your fat foods, right? They're like, yes, okay, there's some crossover, absolutely, but we can kind of almost neatly put things into those boxes. But from a plant-based perspective, there is just so much crossover. Like our protein sources are always going to have, probably a decent amount of carbs or fat or both. It's like all of our foods are kind of mixed. So in approaching that, I think the biggest issues are when people are trying to aim for a calorie deficit but a high protein intake. That can become more difficult. It needs to be a lot more dialed in and well planned, as opposed to an omni diet where we have like a lot of really lean protein sources we can go for.
Yeah.
And then I suppose on the other flip side, when you're trying to get to a really, really high calorie intake, but it's all plant-based, then we're thinking about not overdoing fiber and digestive issues and too much food volume. And so there are very unique challenges that come along with being a plant-based athlete or active person and trying to keep like the same similar macronutrient distribution as you would as an omnivore.
Yeah. And I think I've worked with quite a few people from like Indian heritage, from like a bodybuilding and fat loss perspective. And there's obviously then not only the vegetarian or vegan, then there's the fat loss, but there's also the cultural. And
Totally.
Obviously the food choices are usually like quite high in fat. And I'm like, okay, like I can work a little bit of it in, but like we can't be eating like paneer and stuff like that with every meal. Like you've had intakes
Every
go through the
meal.
roof. Yeah. So it's a tricky one. And I have worked with some like vegetarian clients from cultural backgrounds where there's got to be some aspect of cultural food. And I think obviously like over on the East Coast where you guys are, it's obviously a lot more culturally diverse, I would say, than WA. I think WA is a bit of, it's the land of the bogan. So it's a lot of coaches haven't quite experienced working with clients who do have that large cultural aspect of like, man, this person's not going to be able to go home and tell their wife they can only eat chicken and broccoli for a week.
So, yeah, absolutely. It's just not going to work with their lifestyle and the rest of their family, right? Then they would be eating completely separately. And it's just, I think we need to just realize that obviously food is more than just fueling our body. That from a sports performance perspective, body composition is obviously a huge like social, cultural aspect, and just what I call the joy of food. And that's just literally enjoying food is an important part of our health as well. So it's like it all needs to be balanced for each individual person.
Yeah, and I think the whole food is fuel as a statement has been misinterpreted in the sense of like, yes, it does fuel our body, but it doesn't mean we can't enjoy it in the process. Like it's there's got to be that, I guess, understanding of if you hate what you're doing nutritionally, regardless of how optimal it is, it's not going to last. It's not going to be an applicable method. The client's not going to stick to it. And then we're unknowingly going to compound on an already poor relationship with food.
Totally.
By doing that. And it's, I guess, quite easy for people who have come from an area with zero food control to go the polar opposite and then clutch at every single form of control based around food, which lends into obviously a lot of like behavioral issues. And so many people disregard that, which then creates another issue. Like you could have someone who spent their entire life over consuming, like overweight, to going the opposite way and then refusing to eat anything that doesn't fit into their, like, I guess, nice neat little box of food choices.
Yeah, I think if you don't have a somewhat flexible approach to nutrition, you've probably taken something too far.
Yeah, and I think it's some people get so like, even with I've had some clients go, oh, I can't, like, giving a client the surplus like rice bubbles, and they're like, I can't eat that, it's processed. I'm like, it's puffed. I get that all the time. It's puffed rice. Like there's a sliding scale of hyper processed, and man, trying to explain to people, like, if your carrot is cut up and put in a bag, it classes as processed, so it's gone through some form of processing. And it's, I mean, clients drinking milk and then whinging about processed food. I'm like, you do realize the processes that milk has had to gone through, the pasteurization, all that sort of stuff, so to make it sitting in the bottle on your bench. But yet again, it's the social media feeding these biases of like, oh, we should only eat single ingredient foods. I'm like, God, your food's got chemicals in it. Like, they've all got fucking chemicals in them.
It's just missing the forest for the trees. It's like focusing on these things really don't matter in the grand scheme of things, or just taking like a grain of truth and applying it in the wrong way. It's like, yes, we probably shouldn't be consuming too much ultra processed foods. That's true. But that doesn't mean don't consume any processed foods ever. So it's just
and
like concept way too far.
yeah, I guess you get people like they're like, oh, you're just normalizing people eating junk food. I'm like, no, I just said you're not going to die if you eat a Mars bar. Like it's
It's all about
finding a
dietary context.
and it's like, okay, man, like you said, you've chosen to eat carnivore. Doesn't mean you need to go and get cow's testicles fucking 4 times a week. Like you can do it without being weird.
Yes, you don't need to take to a weird place.
No, and it's I've had that as well with, I guess, with plant-based clients, is that they only eat salad. I'm like, okay, like I understand you're doing this for like an ethical standpoint, and like power to you if that's why you're doing it, but that doesn't mean you can just eat salads and be quote unquote healthy.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
if you're missing, yeah, and it's, I guess if you were to have someone come in and they are looking into going plant-based for whatever reasons, how would you go about, I guess, putting the initial groundwork down with that client to allow them to make the transition to plant-based, but do so in a more psychological and physical healthy way?
Yeah, I think when people want to transition that way, I do tend to try and push them in the direction of taking it more slowly rather than doing like an overnight change, and taking the approach of like swap it, don't stop it. So it's like, all right, if we're taking out meat, what's nutritional equivalent that we're replacing it with? Same with dairy, same with eggs, same with any food that they might be consuming that is part of their nutritional intake, like actually meeting their micronutrient needs and whatnot. It's like, well, how can we actually make these changes so nutritionally we're still getting that adequacy in, but aligning with ethically what you want to do with your diet, if that's being vegan, plant-based, whatever. So I would rather take it slowly with somebody than have that overnight change just for that reason, because it's a lot more easy to manage if you're slowly making these swaps over time. But also depends on why someone is wanting to go plant-based, because I do find myself occasionally giving the talk of, if it's from a health perspective, and they want to go 100% vegan just for health, then really it's like the animal environmental stuff, we're not factoring that in. And then I'm like, well, if we're just talking health, it's probably unnecessary to be completely vegan. And some of the swaps that you will make are probably worse nutritionally than if you kept the animal products. Like a big one is like swapping dairy cheese for vegan cheese. Well, vegan cheese is just basically coconut oil and starch and some flavors. Nutritional content, 0, really. Like we're not getting much out of that, but we are obviously getting vitamins and minerals and all this stuff from real cheese. So there are swaps that don't make sense from a health perspective. But then there are people that are making those swaps for other reasons, and that's completely valid. And the reason that I made those swaps too.
Do you, in terms of like, I guess, percentages with people who are wanting to transition, would you say there's an increasing number of people wanting to transition because they think it's going to be healthier?
Yeah, there are definitely, I get quite a few clients that are wanting to go vegan just because from the health aspect, because they've seen documentaries on Netflix and things like that. And they're like, yeah, I'm going to make this swap. And that's when I tend to start giving that kind of advice. I'm like, we probably don't need that level of restriction for your specific goal, but here is what we can do that would get you there with less restriction. So I tend to say like, pescatarian diet from a health perspective, I think that's probably one of the best things you can do. It's like, because we are like, and it's also adding in not as much ultra processed foods, etc., like things on top of that. But I think if you're having a predominantly plant-based diet, but the only things you're having are like white meat, fish, some eggs, and some lower fat dairy products, nutritionally, like in longevity, like that's going to give you as much benefit as a completely vegan diet from a health perspective. So there's really no need to take it the extra step further unless you've kind of ethically you want to.
Yeah. Well, I guess that would align with obviously like our blue zone countries where we see like a longer life expectancy. That is a large percentage. I mean, like I think Okinawa, Sicily, are sort of areas that are like really high in life expectancy, and it's predominantly fish, chicken, vegetables.
Mediterranean diet is a great example. Like from a longevity point of view, I always point to the Mediterranean diet. I'm like, cool, if you want to do that in a slightly more plant-based way where you're not consuming, as animal products as frequently, that's cool too. But there is a level of restriction that is unnecessary just from a health point of view.
Yeah, and I think I guess I compare it to like weight training. People are like, oh, I want to train 6 days a week. I'm like, dude, you could train 3 and you'd be fine. Like,
you get the same out of it. Yeah.
People go straight from first gear to fifth gear, and I'm like, okay, like that's probably why you've never seen any long-term substantial results, because you try and go from one extreme to another. One of my best mates, after being friends for like 12 years, finally hit me up to coach him. And I think it was the fact that he had like a $9,000 yearly Uber Eats bill.
Oh my gosh, that's a lot of Uber Eats.
Okay, this wasn't the food. This was the delivery fees for a year.
Oh, no, that's so much.
So that's like dinner every night of the week. So
yeah, that's a lot.
Anyway, finally took the jump, and we obviously got his food under control. And I think he's probably arguably he's in the best shape he's ever been in, and was super strict with his diet and got really good results. But then obviously we transitioned the other direction, and I'm like, okay, man, like you can't stay on. I think the lowest his calories got were like 1980. I mean, he would have been 5-6% body fat, like super lean, full serratus showing, like Christmas tree lower back. And I'm like, okay, man, so like that's really lean, but it's also not healthy to stay that lean. So we need to start transitioning the other direction and probably get more towards like a 2,800 to 2,900 calorie baseline. And it was actually hard for someone who was like the king of Uber Eats to reintroduce foods that were his staple before, trying to create that flexibility of like, okay, man, like I want you to have a date night once a week with your partner. I want you to enjoy the occasional glass of wine. I want you to have that balance, because I mean, I guess we compare it to comp preps. People get really attached to the shape they get in through a prep, and they're like, oh, I don't want to leave this. So I'm going to keep doing hours of cardio. I'm going to keep eating next to nothing, and I'm going to keep taking shitloads of gear so I can stay in this shape all year round. And I'm like, oh, probably not an ideal approach, but unfortunately, people do get quite attached to the way they look. And if they've ever gotten the best shape of their life, they're going to find it really hard to sort of transition in the other direction, which is why I think it's important we prepare the client, like if they're in a comp prep or they're in quite an aggressive dieting phase, that there is a handbrake moment where we've got to pull the handbrake up and slow down and transition in the other direction, and I guess make sure those behaviors surrounding food are good for the long term, so that we don't end up with sort of, I guess, lasting effects. I think I've seen it quite a bit in combat athletes who have cutting weight all the time, and I don't know how some of these athletes perform on the amount of calories that they've been eating. I mean, you talk to guys that are like 100 plus kilos. Yeah. And it's like, how are you eating 1,800 calories and training like 3 hours a day? And but then obviously
not so long you can do that. Like, I understand, obviously there are sports where we have to do things like that for periods of time to make weight, get on stage, whatever we're doing, but staying there is obviously not an ideal outcome.
Yes. And I guess the other side of the coin with that is making sure that people don't slingshot too far in the other direction. So that, I mean, you see some people that treat their off season as like a bit of a free for all. And then next prep or next fight or whatever they go into, they're having to get off like a fuckload of weight. And, you know what I mean, their, I guess, metabolism is just not functioning the way it should do. They're not responding the way they should do, because I guess they've gone from one extreme to another. They've gone from being diet and, I guess, appetite being regulated through like reduction of metabolic rate as they get lower and lower in calories. Then it goes the other direction. It's completely unregulated and it's a bit of a free for all. So,
yeah, I think having like a structured approach, like I'm really big with like no matter who you are, after a dieting phase, having some kind of structured approach out, not necessarily like the slow reverse dieting. Like I'm not really pro that, and unless it's like a specific circumstance, but having some kind of structure to it. It's not like, oh, I've reached my goal, now it's a free for all, because you're at a point where your desire to eat is probably super high, your appetite's super high, and if it was a free for all, you're going to likely heavily overconsume calories. So I think it makes sense to have that structure for at least a little bit. Like you might want to, depending on who you are, transition to more intuitive style eating eventually, but you can't do that prior to regulating those hunger hormones and sorting that out first.
Yeah, it's like handing a drug addict a bag of coke and saying, "Don't sniff this."
Yeah, obviously it's not going to go great if we just
No,
throw a really hungry person in a room and go, here's these donuts, like go for gold. Because it's pretty obvious what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think it's, I guess it's our job to prepare people for that and say, hey, look, there is like, this is what's going to happen. This is like some of the things that you may see. I mean, when I've finished with clients with prep, I'm like, okay, cool. So you get like 2 to 3 days of like, just like, I don't worry about tracking anything, but then we need to start reintroducing some structure because one, we need to make sure the structure's there so they're not over consuming massively, but also so that they're not staying in that deficit phase of like, oh,
totally.
I've gotten emotionally attached to being really shredded. And I think, I mean, bodybuilding's a hell of a space. Like I see some of the, or hear some of the horror stories of like what people are doing. Like, oh, I was on 1,200 calories and doing 2 hours of cardio a day. I'm like, okay, like how did that go? They're like, oh, I ended up in hospital twice with like a chest infection. I'm like, and you didn't think that was not normal?
I personally choose not to work in bodybuilding because I think it's an extreme sport that you're obviously putting your body through something that is ultimately usually detrimental to it. And it's not something that I feel comfortable putting my clients through personally. So I just don't touch that space whatsoever. If a bodybuilder wants to come see me in their off season and for a building phase or just like, but I won't take someone stage lean. I don't do it because I don't want my people with a menstrual cycle to lose their menstrual cycle. I don't want to crash someone's hormones. All these things that are part of bodybuilding, unfortunately. Like if you're going to get that lean, you're going to have side effects. It's not going to be good for your health. As a health practitioner, I feel like there is a misalignment there for me. So I don't work in that space.
Yeah, I can agree with that. It's obviously I coach bodybuilders, so it's
not personally.
I think there's a definitive way about going about things, and I see there's a huge push now on the over prescription of PEDs with competitors, both powerlifting and bodybuilding. I mean, I know some powerlifters whose gear usage makes bodybuilders look like they're natty. And it's
ridiculous.
So it's definitely that position there where like, if you aren't, I guess the whole emphasis about being a medical professional or a health professional of any kind is to do no harm. And one could arguably say that putting someone through a comp prep in the first place is probably doing a little bit of harm. But I guess people are going to compete.
Also harm reduce, right? Like we're in a position to, in a space where these people are going to do it regardless, we can take the best route to get them there and reverse them out and try to limit the amount of damage we're doing. But it's also, I feel like bodybuilding is a space that you need a high level of skill and knowledge in that specific space to do it well. So if you don't have that, you have no business coaching clients in that space.
I once had a client who was competing in a natural federation, and we were backstage while she's sort of like getting ready to go on stage, pumping up. And she, there was another competitor there who was backstage like freaking out because she didn't know like what to do, like what to eat, because like her coach was there for whatever reason. And then next season she was a prep coach. I'm like, what?
Exactly.
And I'm like,
they go through their whole identity. They become a coach. They a whole bunch of other people up, but you need a lot of knowledge to be a good bodybuilding coach. And I feel like I'm knowledgeable in other areas, bodybuilding, preps, and not one of them. and I'm fine with that.
And bodybuilding preps are like a one, because you make one slight mistake with a client, and that could be their peak week fucked. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You could,
Takes a high.
I mean, you got clients called coaches messing around with diuretics and things like that, which are super high risk. And I mean, intracellular, extracellular fluid manipulation is just something that most people they'd struggle to spell intracellular rather than understand it. So I'm like, just don't fuck with it. Like, because I've been asked, like, oh, hey man, what do you consider with, like, I mean, that sort of stuff, like management of fluids and like, and I'm like, man, just don't fuck with it. Like, the body does its own thing. Like, don't try and force it to using pharmaceutical diuretics is just a recipe for disaster. And you see like a lot of international pro bodybuilders dying from that specific sort of area of prep. And I remember being at a show once, and there was a girl sitting in the makeup chair, and she literally just passed out, fell out of the makeup chair, flat on the floor. And she'd been potassium loading.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, who the fuck told you to do that? And she essentially, like, it could have gone really, really badly. So I'm like, you're trusting someone with a Cert 3-4 knowledge sometimes. Not always. Some bodybuilding coaches are very educated, and I mean, lucky enough to know quite a few really good ones. But there's also ones that are like, here, take these 10 different PEDs and do 2 hours of cardio a day, and you know what I mean, eat next to nothing. And I mean, I've seen some clients who are like down as low as like 20 grams of fat a day, and I'm like, fuck, man, like. So it's hard because, as you say, people are going to do it regardless. And sometimes people put their faith in, I guess, people who don't deserve it. So we then end up with a lot of people whose experience surrounding powerlifting, bodybuilding, combat sports, whatever the case is not a healthy one. And it's possibly caused some physical and psychological issues. I think I saw one of the guys in the UFC missed weight by miles. And it turns out the person that was handling his weight cut had done a 2-day weight cutting course.
Yes.
And
like, are you serious? Like, why are you, like, again, another very specialized field is acute weight cuts. And that's something that I do a lot of. And I know how tricky that can be. You don't learn that in 2 days. You learn that
and it's
years.
And it's like a friend of mine, Peter Miller, he runs a company called Condition Nutrition. So he is one of the, I guess, leading sports professionals in weight cutting for combat sports.
Yeah.
And he does a lot of work with One Championship, and One Championship has a hydration test that you have to pass as well as making weight. And he's doing quite a successful job of getting people to make weight, be hydrated, do things the right way. And I was talking to him recently, and he was saying that like all of these people come out of the woodwork asking him how he's doing it, who are doing that job already.
Who are meant to be experts in the field. Yeah.
And he's like, hang on a sec. So you want me to tell you how to do the job that you should already know how to do if you're working in this space? So, but because a lot of combat athletes have missed the hydration test. They've made weight, but severely dehydrated.
Yeah.
So it's not very smart or not healthy. So I think, especially with combat athletes and like powerlifters and stuff like that, where like obviously you're not just making weight, you've got to make weight and then perform at a higher level, whether that's moving a considerable amount of weight or getting punched in the head for a few rounds.
Yeah,
and
ideally hydrated for both of those.
Yeah, so it's trying to pass on that knowledge. I guess I will say that a lot of fighters and powerlifters aren't very accepting of new knowledge.
A little bit stuck in our ways, that's for sure. I think the culture around those sports it's a little rigid in our thinking.
Yeah, and I mean it is what it is. Like we said before, the knowledge surrounding all of these things in its infancy, and I think there's a lot of both powerlifters and combat athletes who are coming through who do have someone on their team doing things correctly, I saw the big dogs competition. The guy that won that, is it Connor? The
Don't
there's
know
like
his name.
so there was a photo of them on stage, and it was like the three top guys, and the guy that won big dogs was only like 120 kilos. The guy next to him came silver, was 200.
Oh wow.
And I was like, okay, so like the whole you need to be overweight to move more weight doesn't really fly with this one.
Doesn't always check out that
No,
way.
and it's like, don't get me wrong. There's obviously like you don't need to be be shredded, but you've got people like Dan Green and Lily Bridges, and who are in pretty good shape and still able to move considerable amounts of weight. And then you do sort of have that, I guess, that aspect of powerlifting where the guys are, and girls are quite heavy, and doesn't necessarily correlate to being stronger.
No, not always. Like, obviously, we know sometimes it can, like, obviously impact your leverages and things like that, and that could be beneficial or not,
Yep.
depending on your build. But yeah, absolutely. Like the, I guess, culture around just having all this excess fat mass, especially if you also are taking a lot of PEDs and eating maybe not so great. Like where, okay, you're exercising, but from a longevity perspective, you're probably not going to have a super long career in this sport if you operate that way.
Yeah, and it's obviously like you're putting yourself in that range where your body fat percentage is really high, your blood pressure is really high, your lipid profile is not the best, kidney
Yes.
and liver function aren't the best. And I'm like, okay, just the fact that you can lift really heavy doesn't negate all of those factors.
Exactly. Yes, those things we still want to consider.
Yeah, so I think it's trying to educate people so that they can come at things from a smarter perspective. But I definitely think there's been a shift with the powerlifting space in the last probably 3 to 4 years, where there are a lot more people in decent shape, like they're doing cardio. They're being more evidence based with their PED use rather than like a gram a trend. So it's a positive shift in the right direction, but I think we've still got a long way to go before it's the larger percentage of the industry is doing things in a bit more evidence way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like it's people like ourselves and other experts in the field that hopefully will lead the way in that space.
Yeah.
And ideally, people stop listening to unqualified professionals, quote unquote.
Yeah, and like I've been lucky enough, like I've aligned myself with two MMA gyms over here, and I do a lot of work for their fight team with weight cuts and stuff like that. And it was nice to see how responsive they were to having someone whose, I guess, area of specialty is nutrition. I've had a few gyms before reach out, but then when they see how I do things, oh, that's not how we do things. And I'm like, well, why did you message me in the first place?
Yeah. Was it not for the experts?
Yeah, I was like, okay, like, but with this gym, they're great, and they're like, look, we want to try and say to, I guess, all of our fighters that you're not fighting unless you have him handling your weight cut.
Yeah.
So
Way to go about it.
yeah,
Safer.
so they're like, yeah, so and that's I guess the biggest concern for them, because some of these fighters are only like 18, 19, 20, like they're younger, and they said, look, well, you've proven that you can do it and do it effectively, so we want to make that sort of like a staple so that our fighters are getting access to relevant information surrounding weight cutting, and obviously doing it in a safe manner that's not going to cause long-term effects.
Totally. Absolutely. I think like weight cuts is definitely one of the ones that it gets quite dicey as well. So you want to make sure you're doing it in a safe, protective way.
Yeah, we are. I mean, it's if you handle it in a bad way, like you see, I think boxing is probably the worst for weight cuts in the combat sports space, because it is so old school. And it's like sweatsuit, sauna, like fuck all carbs. And you see a lot of these boxers who fight and then they go back to their room and then someone finds them dead like an hour later.
Yeah.
So
I've definitely I've worked with quite a few professional boxers, and just, I guess, dealing with their coaches and they're wanting them to be active sweating like the day of a weigh-in. I'm like, we've got it handled. Like, we've got it all sorted. Please do not make my client active sweat. But they still, it's part of their quote unquote ritual. So they've got to get in their sweatsuit and go for a run, when ideally we've handled it all through reducing carbs, manipulating fluid and sodium intake, and all those kinds of things. They don't have to do that. But again, it's part of the culture.
Yeah, and that's very much the case. Like my mate that works with like the combat athletes over in Southeast Asia, he was working with a few of the Thais, and
Yeah.
they are so rigid in their way of thinking. And they had like one of their champions, one championship actually brought my friend Pete over to handle his weight cut directly because he'd missed the last two. And in his response was like, "Wow, is it this easy?"
Yeah.
because he was used to just like starving the shit out of himself and doing fuckloads of cardio in a sauna suit, and he's like, "Oh, this is a bit more," and he made weight for the first time in like 18 months. So it's definitely nice to see that, and I think it does sometimes take us having someone of that bias and showing them like firsthand, like, "Hey, look, we can do this in a much smoother transition." And then it's like a ripple effect. They go and tell people, and then it slowly starts changing the industry for the better. But sometimes we just need to get that initial conversation going and explain to people like, "Hey, look, you don't need to be feeling like you're dying to make weight.
It doesn't need to be this hard, especially for like a lighter weight cut where it's maybe only 3 to 5% of body weight. It's like that actually doesn't need to feel like trash. Like that's actually
it could be done with just fiber manipulation and reducing carbohydrate intake for a couple of days. Like
you don't even really need to touch the dehydration aspect, right? Like a lot of the time, unless we're really up towards that 7+% body weight that we're trying to drop.
And I think that's like I had a few guys recently, 2 young guys who made weight, and they're like, "Shit, that was easy." I'm like, "Man, you don't not aware of just how much fluid and food volume we hold in our digestive system." Yeah. And once we can obviously reduce fiber intake, sort of play around with carbohydrate intake and maybe do a slight water load, it's actually quite easy. But I think a lot of people leave way too much weight on in the first place, and it starts creeping up towards like the 12, 13, 14% body weight. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's like not ideal, but there's definitely a smarter way of going about it. But we'll probably finish up there because I don't want to keep you all day. I'm sure you've got places to be, things to do. So, obviously, finishing up, if people want to get in contact with you to obviously inquire about your services, or you put out a lot of good information, a lot of good content, where is the best place for them to do this?
So Instagram is definitely best. So I'm plantstrong_dietitian, or you can go to my website, which is plantstrongco.com.
Awesome. Thank you very much for coming on today. Obviously, we covered quite a bit. Hopefully, I didn't keep you too long, but
no, you're good.
We'll try and get this one up nice and quickly, and we'll go from there.
Sweet. Sounds like a plan. Right. Thank you.
In recording. All right.